So it's really important to know how a research article is structured because they're long and they're hard to read. So first off, the research article has its title, which is going to be really nice and detailed. So you'll want to read it carefully. It'll tell you what the study's about. And then we kind of narrow down to the abstract, which is this, sorry, I phased in too soon. The abstract is just like a really short summary of the research. Then we move into the introduction, which kind of starts you off broad and then narrows down to what the study is about. Then you have the lit review, the method, the results, that's the body of the paper. Then you have the conclusion, or in APA style paper, it's called the discussion, and the references. So those are the parts of the paper that you'll be working with, and it's really important to know what they're about and how to approach each one of these sections. And again, note that in APA style papers, we call that last section the discussion. So just really briefly what I wrote down here, since I wrote it, that the lit review part, the intro and lit review, they're building the research foundation and telling you why the problem is significant, and you're going to find the research question and hypothesis usually at the end of this section. The methods talk about who the study used and what it was about. It'll have different subsections in it. The results are going to have a lot of numbers and maybe some charts and figures. The discussion is really going to be pretty easy to read and pretty interesting. It's pulling the findings together, linking it to previous research, telling you what was wrong with the study and where you should go or where research should go. Then there will be a reference section, the list of all the sources in the study in alphabetical order. And there may be, depending on if you're reading a manuscript or a published result, there may be manuscript that has like the survey tools they used, interview questions, or any other original material they used in the study. So the title and abstract are really important. You're going to get a lot of information here. It's sort of like watching the trailer for the movie, right? To decide if you actually want to watch it. So you'll want to read these things pretty carefully. The title is going to be, pretty direct, accurate, interesting, but concise. It's not trying to grab your attention. It's trying to tell you what the paper is about. So it's very different than a news story title of a research article. So this is just trying to tell you what the study is, and the abstract just expands on that. It's just really clear, unbiased, precise, tells you usually one short paragraph that tells the rationale, hypothesis, study findings, and implications. Very, very short. So this is how you can tell if you want to read the article. Is it relevant to you? Here's a Jordan article, Sad and Guilty, Affective Influences on the Explanation of Conflict in Close Relationships. So you can see from this really easily, affective influence on why people have conflict in close relationships. You know what the study is going to be about. So you can't just rely on the abstract, especially in this class, because you need to know what the methods were used. That's what we're studying in this class. But you at least know if it's relevant to your topic by reading carefully the title and abstract. So this is an example title and abstract. You'll see that we have a nice, not that long of a title here, but pretty clear. Young infants prefer prosocial to antisocial others. And then you'll see an abstract that has a lot of detail and tells you exactly what the study does and what they found. So both of these, you should read every word carefully, title and abstract. So next we go on to the lit review. So you'll have an introduction, which is usually one paragraph, sometimes two. And in that introduction, the researcher will establish the significance of the problem, why it's important, the gap in the existing literature, like the question that hasn't yet been answered, and the reason it's important to answer that question. You should see that in an introduction. And then you'll continue on to the lit review, but it may or may not have a separate heading. It might just continue on after that first paragraph, and it should lay out the entire research sequence that precedes this study. It should, if there's any big theory that they're working with, it should introduce the theory. And if there are any key terms they're going to be using, it should include those terms along with their definitions. And then it should end with restating what that question is that we call the gap, the research question, and the hypotheses. And so you'll remember, once again, I mentioned there's always going to be these citations or these parentheses in the middle of sentences telling you what the source of the information is. And so again, that can make it harder to get used to. So you really have to be diligent when you're reading. They try and be as brief as possible. What that means is that they choose their words really carefully, and they might say a lot with, say, just one sentence. So you can't skip forward. It's not like reading a novel. And then acronyms. An acronym is just an abbreviation. Like PTSD is an abbreviation or an acronym for post-traumatic stress disorder. And in this lit review and introduction, they're going to introduce those acronyms, but they'll only introduce them once. And so they might tell you, we're going to use the acronym helping characters, and we're going to use HC. And the first time they use HC, they'll tell you what it stands for. They'll write helping characters, and then in parentheses, HC. After that, they're just going to use HC. So if you come to an acronym and you don't know what it is, you need to just go back to the beginning of the paper and look for the first time you see the acronym, which is where it will be defined. So the introduction, the very first paragraph or 2 paragraphs possibly of the paper, you should read carefully, because these lay out the logical foundation for what is being done, and they give you all the lit review sources. When you're reading, you're going to find it's hard to read a little bit because we have all of these source citations right in the body of the papers. And so that can be a little bit frustrating when you're trying to read, but eventually if you keep practicing, your eye will become trained in skipping over those when it's important, but paying attention to the dates when that's important. So both are important, and you'll learn how to read these with practice. But if you find that it's not as fluent as reading just a nice news article or something, you're right about that. But you will find that they are going to sort of lay out what they're doing and tell you why they're doing it right in this first paragraph, first 2 paragraphs sometimes, so read your introduction carefully. So following the introduction, the first paragraph or 2, you're going to come to the body of the lit review, which can be several pages long. And it's important, you know, it lays the logical research foundation for the work the researchers are doing. But students often get tangled up in the lit review. Like sometimes students will never even read far enough to get to what this study was about because they're taking so long getting tangled up in the paper's lit review. So don't do that. If it's a super long lit review, you can, I would almost recommend doing a skim method unless you're going to really use the paper as a foundational paper. Then you read the whole review. But otherwise, I'd say just get the gist of the logic they're doing in the lit review, but don't worry about getting every single detail down on paper because that was their job. Your job is to understand these researchers' study and why they did it. And so just, if you're going to skim anywhere in the paper, skim in the lit review until you get to the last paragraph of the lit review, where you should read carefully again. So the last paragraph of the lit review of an original research paper is really important to read carefully because they're going to tell you the gap and the hypothesis. By gap, I mean the question that isn't answered in all this previous research that they think it's important to answer, and then what they're hypothesizing. And so right here, they're sort of telling you the gap in a roundabout way. They're saying, in proposing that infants evaluate others based on their social behavior toward third parties, it's important to demonstrate that infants' preference for those who behave pro-socially versus anti-socially applies across a range of social interactions, not just to a specific social scenario. So that's what they're saying in terms of the gap. They're saying this previous research has only done a single social scenario. And then the next sentence says, why is it important to know that? They say, well, adult humans evaluate each other across countless social interactions with many kinds of goals. So that's why it's important. And then they say what they're going to do about it or what their hypothesis is. The present study addresses the generality of infant social preferences by asking whether infants in the first year of life evaluate those who behave pro-socially and anti-socially in 2 object-oriented scenarios. So here I would recommend, again, read this particular paragraph carefully. Look for the gap and the hypothesis. So that was the literature review in which they described the experiment. Now let's look at the details. So a methods section in general describes the study that's conducted in sufficient detail that another person could replicate it and also understand anything that might have been unique in this implementation of the study. So they will tell us the participants, exactly who was in the study. We'll look at the example. They'll tell us the design, the structure of the study, may be singled out separately or embedded within the other details. It will include the materials, so you'll learn everything that was used, and in studies with adults, this would include any inventories or questionnaires that have been used. And then the procedure, exactly what participants experience when they participate in the study. You might have other sections like statistical procedure, or as I already mentioned, some of these might be collapsed. It definitely should be clear, understandable, and interesting, and this should be sort of a fun part of the paper to read. Most of your critique that you're going to do of research studies will be critiquing the method. So after the lit review, you're going to find the methods section and read every single word carefully. This is what it'll look like. They'll tell you exactly who was in the study, exactly what they did. Read it word for word because this is how you're going to conduct your own experiment. Read carefully. Once again, read the methods carefully. They're going to tell you exactly what they did. Look at the level of detail here that helps you understand their study. Infants sat on their parents' lap and were presented with a clear plastic box containing a rattle that would be presented during the puppet show. An experimenter held the box in front of the infant and said, "Look," shaking box, "Look," grabbing edge of box, "Look," opening box, and "Ooh," lifting the rattle out of the box. So you'll see this is a scripted study and this is giving you the script. Read the methods section carefully. Read carefully. So this slide shows the primary thing you'll be asked to do as you read through experiment 2 is to parse the study. So first off, let's identify the independent variable. And in this case, I think there are 2 independent variables. First, independent variable 1, we had helpfulness. Condition 1, pro-social puppet, versus condition 2, the antisocial puppet. And then we also had the second independent variable that they introduced in that social condition versus the inanimate object condition. And I've named this variable intentionality. And so they were trying to test whether the intentionality of the protagonist would impact whether or not the infants preferred the helper. And in condition 1, we had a puppet protagonist, or like a character, a social protagonist, versus condition 2, in which we had that mechanical pincher protagonist with no social kind of characteristics. So these are the variables that the researchers thought would impact the choice the infants made. So the dependent variable is the infant preference for prosocial others. And the conceptual definition I got directly from their paper, but I had to go all the way to the discussion to find what I thought was a good conceptual definition. Infants' positive assessment of those who aid others in their goals to reach a particular location or move along a given trajectory, and negative assessment of those who block such goals. I think that's a good conceptual definition based on their own words. It includes like their internal state, their assessment, and it includes behaviors that they're observing through their preference choices. So I think it's a good enough conceptual definition. And then the operational definition, how are they measuring it? They're measuring it through the infant choice of a pro-social puppet who helped a protagonist open a box, or an antisocial puppet who slammed the box shut. And so these are really important concepts. Don't just really work hard on these. Ask questions if you don't really get it. And then what extraneous variables were controlled by the researcher? I don't think I've named all of them, but I think I've named many of them. They controlled the possibility of parent bias or experimenter bias through a double blind. meaning that neither the experimenter nor the parent turned at a 90-degree angle and closed their eyes so they couldn't see what choice the infant was making, and couldn't in any way influence the infant. And likewise, the experimenter didn't know which of the two puppets had been the one that was the helper. So in that case, I think they controlled those pretty well through a double blind. Then they controlled the color and entry direction of the opener-closer puppet through counterbalancing, meaning that sometimes the helper was orange and at opposite times, alternating, the helper puppet was gray. And also likewise, half the time the helper puppet entered from the right and half the time the helper puppet entered from the left. So they took away those possibility of extraneous variables. And I also remembered that they controlled for differences in infant habituation by repeating the procedure until the infant looked away for 2 seconds, at which point that infant was habituated. And so that's how long they repeated the experiment, so that controlled for differences in infant characteristics. So we won't spend so much time on the results because it's going to be a harder section for you, especially since a lot of you haven't had statistics. But even if you've had statistics, it can be a challenge because they use pretty advanced statistics these days. So what it's going to present is the quantitative results of the study. So all the charts, the tables, the data. You'll notice that each table and chart is numbered and has a title, and that the narrative just before the table or chart will talk about it. But it's just going to talk about it in terms of numbers right here. So they're not going to tell you any implications. They're just giving you the numbers. And so it can be really hard. So you can look for statements like significantly higher or significant difference. That word significant is really important because it means that there's only a slim chance that this result could occur by chance. And you could also look for something like p less than 0.05 or p less than 0.01, because that means that the odds of getting such a result by chance have a probability of less than 5% or less than 1%. So these are the things you can look for. So let's take a look in our paper. So the results section is the section most students think they should read really carefully, but it's super hard because you have to know some statistics usually to understand the results section. So my recommendation is that you read it, but you don't get frustrated with all the statistics. Try and understand what they're saying, but know that they're going to restate it for you in easier language in the discussion section. Read it, don't get frustrated. However, if you see something like this, p less than 0.01, that means that they have a statistically significant result, that they're happy that there was a difference between the conditions. So this p just means probability. The probability of getting a result like this is less than 1%. That's what that means. And you can look for this and always know that if you see something like this, it's significant. If you come to a graph or something like this, these in the results section, I do think you should take a close look at, because usually you can wrap your head around what a graph is showing you. It's a graphic of the results of their numeric data. I would say study this graph carefully and try to understand it. And then the discussion is the last that we'll go through. So this is just a summary of the results of the study and placed into a bigger picture. And they'll summarize it in an easier to understand language. They'll tell you what the implications are, like what's important about it, what changes does it suggest to our way of thinking. And then likely they'll circle back and relate it to the earlier studies they presented in the Lit Review. And they'll tell you the limitations of the study. These are factors that limit the findings, like how much we can rely on the findings. So they'll criticize their own study in this section, basically. It could include things that went wrong in the study or limit its generalizability or just design things that they couldn't control. And they'll indicate future research. Now, we're not going to see all of this in the discussion for the paper that we're reading because I'm only sharing with you the discussion of Experiment 1. But all this bigger discussion will take place in Experiment 2, so you should look for that. And incidentally, action steps would be here as well. If the researchers think the result is really important, they might suggest changes to policy or practices around their findings. So the discussion section, once again, my advice is read this carefully. They're going to be explaining the results in words you can understand, telling you why they're important, explaining the limitations, and suggesting future research. So take your time to read this carefully.